Sue's Bible, or my mom's Bible, Sue's Bible too, but my mom's Bible, and another thing. There's a couple things that have really come forward to me that have really found out a lot. For you, all of you guys who are making notes and stuff in your Bibles to pass down to generations, do them in ink. Pencil fades. It's really, really hard. Thanks for everybody for coming out. You know, eulogy sounds like such a, I don't know, to me anyway, it's always had a little bit of a bad connotation. So I tell you what, if we can agree to this, we're okay. I'm going to tell you a story instead. Okay? Story work? Okay, good. And if it's okay, I'll walk up and down the aisle because there's too much nervous energy going on and all sorts of stuff. So, I wanted to tell you a story about my mom, but I kind of need to back up a little bit first so that you can kind of get a little bit better understanding of where she came from and what formed her life. My grandmother, her mother, was raised on a small farm out in Kansas, out in a very rural area. And she remembered, and my mom told me many times about how during the winters or bad times, the Indians would come by their house, and she would stand there behind her mother's skirt, this is my grandmother's skirt, and watch as the Indians came begging for food. And at times they would, after they got kind of but they got used to seeing that sort of thing, they started leaving food out on the fence posts for people to come by and pick up. So she was just like way out there in rural Kansas. My grandmother died in 1966, but the big thing that she did that she held on to was that she made it through to my high school graduation, and that she wore a very special dress that my mother and her had gone to pick out. Being in high school at that point in time, it wasn't really all that big of a deal to me, but looking back on it, I remember the effort that she made to come and get there because she was dying of brain cancer at the time, and took a lot of effort for her to get there. But she was, or so I heard, was very, very proud and wanted to be there. So my grandfather, he was born in Illinois, and his family had a small, rural, little country store, as well as some acreage that they sold and raised vegetables and stuff like that for the local community. And as a kid growing up, he wanted no part of that. Absolutely no part of that whatsoever. So off he went and joined the Navy. And this was the beginning of World War I. And at that time, through his training and everything else, he got to where he was doing mechanical work on dirigibles. How many of you guys know what a dirigible is? Okay. How about another word? A blimp? How about another? Here's another one for you. The famous cover of the Led Zeppelin 1 album. The Hindenburg going down, right? Those were dirigibles, and that's what he worked on. And he was in the Navy at a time, and I remember asking him this as a little kid, as only a little kid can ask their grandparent. Can you tell me, Grandpa, did the ships in the Navy still have wooden decks? And he gave me the funniest look, but he just kindly smiled and said, no, they were steel at that time. So they had made the transition from wood to sails to steam to ships and all that good stuff. So I know we got some guys from the Midwest and stuff. But somehow after the Navy, he wound up wanting to go back in Kansas and worked on a threshing crew. Does anybody know what a threshing crew is? Steve, I know, yeah. Anyway, that's where he met my mother, or my grandmother back there in Kansas. And it wasn't too terribly long after they had gotten married that there wasn't a lot of work out there at the time. So they decided that they were going to pack up and move back to St. Louis. And probably in the mid-20s or so, bars were still, restaurants. They weren't there. That's the only place that served food. So my grandma coming straight out of Kansas, right, being a little farm girl, my grandpa takes her into this bar to have supper. And she's never been in this kind of environment before. And she walks in, and there's an argument that breaks out between two guys who'd obviously been drinking and having all sorts of fun back in there. And the next thing you know, this guy pulls out a gun, and he shoots this guy. And my grandmother looked at my grandfather, and she says, "Harley, what kind of a city have you brought me to?" So that gives you a little bit of background about where she came from. And then my grandpa was also a Southern Baptist minister. So there was no dancing, card playing, and all that kind of stuff that was common at that time. My mother was born in 1923. And in 1929, the Great Depression started. And she often told me and consoled me the fact that she was not the product or not the start of the beginning of the Great Depression. She didn't cause it. So they stayed around St. Louis for a while and then had some problems with work again. So one of the guys that he had working for as a customer was a guy who happened to own a girls' ranch, like a dude ranch, out in Colorado, in Granby, Colorado. Anybody know where Granby, Colorado is? You're like up in the mountains, way up in the mountains. So it snowed really, really heavily up there, and the house that they lived in had an outhouse out back. So she would say that getting to and from the outhouse was a quick adventure during the winter. Yes. They also had they rode a horse, Pollyanna, to school back and forth. It was her and her sister. And at lunchtime they would come out and feed the horse. And it was a fun time for them. And the ride going back home to their house was always a quick ride because the horse wanted to get home faster than it wanted to go to school. So for guys who don't want to go to school, there you go. It's inbred in us from horses. Anyway, she moved back. The family moved back to St. Louis eventually, and she graduated. My uncle, her brother Don was born when she was in high school. She graduated from high school and made a pact with a group of her cousins that they were all going to join and leave the area. They were all going to go join the military somewhere because at this time World War II was starting to break out. And finally what happened, and I don't know, was anybody kind of surprised to see the Marines here this morning? You'd never know that she was a Marine, but she was. I can attest to that. So around the age 20, she left home and joined the Marines, of all places. She was stationed at Camp Lejeune, and she started telling this story a lot of times too. Lejeune is in North Carolina, and she was transferred out to the West Coast. Well, along the way, it started out, this little troop train started out with just a couple, 3 cars. And by the end of the journey, in Santa Barbara, you know, she could tell that they were stopping along the way all the time. By the time they hit LA, she said that you could not even see from the front of the train to the back of the train. They had picked up that many cars all across the nation. People being brought out to the West Coast to serve out here. That's where she met my dad. If you remember during the slideshow, there was a picture of them laying on the beach. There's a famous story that goes with that one too. And the story is this: being from the Midwest and a good Southern or a good farm girl, she'd never been or seen the ocean before. So when he took her to the ocean for the first time, there was a bunch of seaweed that washed up around her ankles. And she was scared to death, thought it was snakes. And that was the first and the last time that she ever went into the ocean. In fact, when Sue and I went to Hawaii years ago, it was the only trip we've ever taken to Hawaii without getting in the water. But it was always one of those kind of myth stories that you always hear about and think about. It was true because she wrote it on the back of that picture. So, anyway, they divorced after the war. They moved back to St. Louis, and they were building a small house when the Korean War broke out. My dad was still in that time slot when they could call you back in, so he was called back in to go to Korea to fight the war over there. And an interesting thing, fire broke out and burned our house down. So my mom and me, and Kathy, you weren't even born yet, I don't think. So we were kind of, I guess, technically homeless for a little while, but it wasn't too terribly long. You know, we got taken care of anyway. But and Jim, I got to tell you, it's just a quick rabbit hole, okay? When he was over in Korea, my dad became interested in and had this mechanical ability to run a machine shop. And he built this machine shop that they could haul around on the back end of trucks. And the reason that they were doing this stuff was because they were manufacturing airplane parts that were breaking down, and they couldn't wait for them to get shipped back in from over to Korea. So they were manufacturing stuff. And I guess that's kind of how he got his interest in the aircraft industry. Because when he came out, finally got released, went to work for Douglas Aircraft. It wasn't even McDonnell Douglas Aircraft. And it wasn't Boeing. It was just Douglas. It was before all of that stuff merged and everything happened. And he saw and started to change this thing, over the period of the next 3 to 4 years. The aircraft industry in St. Louis went down. So we, over the next 3 to 4 year period, we moved like 4 or 5 times. We moved from St. Louis to Hamburg, New York, which is just south of Buffalo, to Berwick, Pennsylvania, and back to St. Louis. And then we finally came out here to California. So you have the aircraft industry to blame for me being here today. That's kind of a brief synopsis of her life up to that point. But you think about the fact that she lived 95 years and what she saw, many, many changes. She saw 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, the USA grow and change into the superpower that it became. She saw entertainment change from radio to movies to black and white TV to color TV to satellite TV and cable. And one of the things that all you kids got to realize, and even us, the remotes weren't invented So we were the remotes. You go change the channel. So, such things as the Helms Bakery truck. You ever remember those things?
I remember those.
Yeah. Because of the things that were going on in her lifetime, she also saw a change from dirigibles to propeller planes, to jets, to rockets, to all the stuff that was happening. She saw things like the changes between the Eisenhower administration, the Kennedy, the Nixon, and what we've gone through up until today, from the atomic bomb being dropped, from the Kennedy assassination to the glorious point of man walking on the moon, and the launch to Mars. So there's been a lot of things that have gone on and changed in that 95-year window that is just amazing. She loved to dance and to watch black and white musicals. Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, people like Sid Charisse. Ginger Rogers very famously once said, "I did the same things and the same dance routines as Fred Astaire did, except I had to do them backwards." And in essence, that's kind of the way I think my mom and dad's marriage and relationship were. They were both unique individuals, but they bounced off of each other and made it work and made it happen really well. So it was a pretty amazing lifetime. A couple other quick stories. When she first moved in with us about 11 years ago, she would go walk around the neighborhood. And she said, one day when she was coming back home, she said, "Man, you guys live in the most friendly neighborhood. Every day around 3:30, I go for the same walk, and there's always somebody that says, 'Hello, hello.' And I look around, I never see them, but I can't figure out, 'Hello.' Well, it turns out it was the ice cream guy that was driving by. And they announced me. So, but we still live in a famous neighborhood. She was a loving, caring person, a professional warrior, and very, very, very concerned about her family. She also had a very, very deep passion for a couple different things. For God, for her family, for her country, as you saw from the Marine Corps, and most importantly, for chocolate. If you ever wanted to be in favor, there was always chocolate involved in some sort of a transaction. So, I had a couple conversations with her regarding cookies and stuff like that. She always had at least a couple bags of cookies that were open and ready to eat. And I got to the point where I was asking her, I said, "Man, you've been consuming so many of these, but how can we keep up with you?" And she says, "Well, there's this little mouse that keeps running around around my room, that is eating all my cookies." And I said, "You know what, Mom, but at this time period, that mouse has got to weigh at least 200 pounds. And relative to chocolate, we've received direct inquiries from Hershey's and other manufacturers wondering why their production is falling off a little bit. And the cookies were the same way. I want to leave you with this kind of a remembrance. There's a commercial running now that states that the average American family moves around 11 times in their lifetime. You guys seen that commercial? Okay. At the last count, I can remember that we moved somewhere around 18 times. So this is what my last thought I want to leave you with. she's moved on one last time. And it's time to rejoin with the family, to settle down and finally get unpacked and hear the rest of her family say, welcome home. Thank you.